I have another amendment. I have been informed that the majority plans to block consideration of this amendment, which is number 1367, regarding the transparency at the Federal Reserve. I would nonetheless like to take a few moments to discuss it. The Federal Reserve, the unelected central bank of the United States, enjoys a monopoly over the flow of our money and credit, but has never been completely transparent and accountable to Congress since its creation in 1913. Since 1913, our dollar has lost more than 95% of its purchasing power. My amendment is called the Federal Reserve Sunshine Amendment, and it is modeled after legislation sponsored by Representative Ron Paul of Texas in the House and our colleague Senator Sanders of Vermont here in the Senate. This amendment amends Section 714 of Title 31 of the U.S. Code to remove existing restrictions on how the Government Accounting Office can audit the Federal Reserve. With these limitations gone, the Fed's discount window operation, funding facilities, open market operations, and agreements with foreign central banks and governments would all be finally open to congressional oversight. The Government Accounting Office would be required to audit the Fed by the end of 2010 and to report its findings to Congress. Every dollar created by the Fed has an effect on the value of the dollars in our pockets and bank accounts. We need to pay more attention to the effect of Washington decisions, whether fiscal policy made by Congress or monetary policy made by the Fed. They all are ultimately borne by the American people. The Federal Reserve will create and disperse trillions of dollars in response to our current financial crisis. Americans across the nation, regardless of their opinion on the bailout, want to know where the money has gone, exactly how much has been spent, and what collateral has been taken in return. That is why you see so much bipartisan support in the House, in Bernie Sanders and Jim DeMint being on the same side in the Senate. Inflation is a hidden tax, and we unfortunately forget about it too often when we are debating spending bills here in Congress. Our fiscal actions, higher deficits, increased long-term debt, entitlement obligations will necessarily need to be paid for by printing new money or borrowing more money from an increasingly skeptical world. Either option results in higher interest rates for consumers and a devaluing of the dollars they have already earned and saved. Allowing the Fed to operate our nation's monetary system in almost complete secrecy leads to abuse, inflation, and a lower quality of life for every American. Unfortunately, the majority has decided to use a procedural tactic to block a vote on this amendment by invoking something called Rule 16. This is a rule that prevents policy being added to spending bills. The majority claims that we do not legislate on appropriation bills. Of course, that is false. In fact, there are already Rule 16 violations in the bill we're trying to amend. We also saw this majority airdrop the Cash for Clunkers program into the recent supplemental appropriation bill. The majority may claim that this amendment is not relevant to the underlying bill, but in fact, there are already provisions in this bill related to the Government Accounting Office audits. So this language is quite appropriate on this bill. The legislation has already received the support of more than 1/2 of the House of Representatives within a few short months of its introduction. It's time for the Senate to show its support. Mr. President, I would like to ask the Majority Leader again to allow a vote on Amendment 1367 regarding a GAO audit of the Federal Reserve. Madam President, I'd like to call up Amendment 1367.
Without objection, the clerk will report.
The Senator from South Carolina, Mr. DeMint, proposes an amendment number 1367.
Senator from Nebraska.
I make a point of order against the DeMint amendment that it's legislation on appropriations.
Madam President?
The point of order is well taken. The amendment.
I regret the objection.
The amendment falls.
If I would like to make just a few comments about that, since the other side is arguing that Rule 16 applies here. My amendment contains language to an existing GAO audit of the Federal Reserve. because it is legislative in nature, and in other words, because it actually addresses the audit itself and not just the funds for the General Accounting Office. They say because of that it's out of order. And Madam President, I'd like to ask a parliamentary inquiry. Is the language in Section 1501B dealing with an existing GAO audit of the National Transportation Safety Board legislative?
It is.
I thank the chair. Does it violate Rule 16?
It does.
So the Democrats are suggesting that it is somehow illegitimate for me to offer an amendment dealing with an existing GAO audit when they themselves have included language dealing with other audits that flatly violates Rule 16. Madam President, just further parliamentary inquiry. Is the language in Section 1501C regarding a GAO audit of local educational agency spending legislative in nature and in violation of Rule 16?
Yes.
I thank the chair. What about Section 1501D, which repeals a GAO audit of small business participation in the Alaska National Pipeline? Is that legislative in nature, and does it violate Rule 16?
Yes, it is.
I have a long list that are here that I understand from the parliamentarian that the answers will continue to be yes. So, Madam President, we have several provisions obviously dealing with the GAO and GAO audits in this bill. The other side cannot stand behind a rule that they have flagrantly violated themselves. There is an earmark in this bill for Nebraska. It's the only earmark in the bill. I would ask the chair, what about the provisions in the Library of Congress section containing a $200,000 earmark for Durham Museum in Omaha, Nebraska? Is that a legislative item, and does it violate Rule 16?
It is legislative, but the chair is aware of a defense in germaneness.
Thank you, Madam President. Well, then, would it be accurate to say that the provision contains legislative language that meets the definition of Rule 16, even though it is arguably germane to the House language?
It is legislative in nature.
Well, thank you, Madam President. I think I've made my point, and I won't take this any further. Clearly, there's a double standard here. One of the most, I think, sought-after amendments that we have probably brought up in the House and the Senate since I've been here is an audit of the Federal Reserve.
The people losing their homes, of course. In a related story, major protests in cities across the nation today. They rallied against the Federal Reserve. Here in Chicago, demonstrators are calling for a dismantling of the Fed.
In the Fed! Constitution! In the Fed!
Activists believe the Federal Reserve Bank is responsible for the current financial crisis. They claim government bailouts will further disrupt the economy and plunge the nation into a severe depression. They support legislation introduced by Representative Ron Paul to shut down the nearly century-old Federal Reserve Bank.
We're going to let everybody know this is the real government, the private bankers. We're going to let everybody know they're the ones that have cut off the credit. They're the ones that are stealing our birthright. They're the ones raping us, and that we're not going along with it anymore. And that we know this private criminal organization is the threat and is the enemy. So I salute you all for coming out here and exposing these criminals.
Now, the first of a two-part conversation with former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan. During his 18-plus years at the Fed, Greenspan worked with 4 presidents, faced financial crises in America and abroad, and made some controversial decisions about economic policy. His new book is The Age of Turbulence. Jim Lehrer spoke with him late last week.
Mr. Chairman, welcome. Because interest rates were down, it was easy to buy a house.
Absolutely.
And the market boomed.
And the market boomed.
Did it boom too much?
Well, yes, I think it did boom too much.
But did you don't feel any responsibility for keeping interest rates low?
Well, let me tell you,
okay.
we had no choice. I mean, we're the vaunted Federal Reserve, but this global force was suppressing us. We actually tried in 2004 to get mortgage interest rates up and to put some sort of clamp on the extent of the housing boom, and we failed. Because usually when we moved short-term interest rates up, which is what the Federal Reserve does, long-term rates go with it. It didn't this time. We tried the same thing in 2005.
Didn't happen.
Didn't happen. Had we done it back in 2002, there's no doubt in my mind, nothing would have happened. And as a consequence, we, and in fact every other central bank, could not confront this issue. And what I'm increasingly beginning to conclude is when you get bubbles like this, there is no way of diffusing them until the speculative fever breaks on its own. We tried numbers of things, and other people tried numbers of things, but what is different about the United States is when our bubble burst, housing prices started down. Our actual rise in prices is probably a little below average around the world. But we, as a consequence of having a major thrust in trying to increase home ownership in this country, developed properly, in my view, subprime mortgages, so a lot of people who would not otherwise be able to own a home were able to own a home.
But then their interest rates went up over a period of time. That's when they got hurt, right?
Well, the real problem began because a very significant proportion of those loans were on terms which shouldn't have been made.
What is the proper relationship? What should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. So long as that is in place and there is no evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing, then what the relationships are don't frankly matter. And I've had very good relationships with presidents. Don't frankly matter. And don't frankly matter. And don't frankly matter. And I've had very good relationships with presidents.